Why am I telling you about Cold War espionage in a podcast on empaths? Because the empath is essentially a deep cover spy in their own life. And that is much more widespread than you think. 60% of working adults reported feeling that they cannot be their authentic selves at work. We see this exact same pathology scaled up to the heights of modern geopolitics, completely erasing borders. Do you see the grand design now? The entire planet has become a massive symbiotic ecosystem of the inflated and deficient ego. But the history of the Soviet spy Jack Barsky provides a beautifully simple, brilliant blueprint for healing. Welcome back to part 2 of our deep dive into the hidden darkness of human psyche. In the first part of this episode, we shattered one of modern culture's most sacred myths, the illusion of the blameless, holy, so-called empath, who stripped away the spiritual fluff and exposed the deficient ego, a psychological mutation driven by an insatiable need for control through victimhood, martyrdom, and the complete suppression of healthy aggression. We looked into the historical mirror of Nuremberg trials and discovered that totalitarian machines are never built by a lone monster at the top. They are fueled from below by millions of submissive little people who gladly outsource their conscience to a tyrant in exchange for a legal outlet for their buried fermenting rage. Finally, we examined the neurobiology of this infection, showing how high control systems literally force the prefrontal cortex offline, deleting the individual I and turning human beings into biological drones running a centralized software. And we left off with a burning question. How do we stop this neurological hijacking? What separates a compliant cog from a truly healthy sovereign psyche? How do we actually heal the deficient ego? To understand the blueprint of our cure, we have to look at a dark, fascinating corner of human history that you would never expect to find in a conversation about empathy. We need to talk about Cold War espionage. Think about a real man named Jack Barsky, a Soviet KGB agent sent to the United States during the Cold War under a completely fabricated identity. For over 10 years, he lived a perfectly normal American life. He paid his taxes, made friends, and coached his daughter's soccer team. Nobody around him had any idea that every single conversation, every friendship, and every smile was a calculated performance. To survive, Barsky relied heavily on a psychological mechanism called compartmentalization, the brain's way of building thick internal walls to separate conflicting realities so they don't crash into each other. It's like locking your real values, your real memories, and your true self in one room, while performing a completely different character in another. But over time, the psychology behind this double life became deeply disturbing. Those internal walls aren't made of brick, they are made of sheer willpower, which is strictly limited resource. The walls of your mental compartments begin to crack under the weight of so-called cognitive dissonance, the unbearable tension of acting against who you truly are. When you perform a fake identity for long enough, the fake self starts to feel more familiar than the real one, and the authentic self beneath it begins to rot. Eventually, the cognitive dissonance leads to what intelligence researchers call identity erosion. That was exactly what happened to Barsky, who could no longer tell who he really was, a Soviet spy or an American citizen. Now, why am I telling you about Cold War espionage in a podcast on empaths? Because the empath is essentially a deep cover spy in their own life. They weren't recruited by the KGB or the CIA. They were recruited by their own childhood fear of rejection, driven by a deficient ego, desperately trying to avoid rejection by their parents, colleagues, bosses, friends, or partners. They use their high emotional intelligence, their ability to read rooms and sense what others want, not to connect, but to disguise. They become exactly who the world wants them to be, completely abandoning their own truth. They are undercover agents in their own lives, hiding their real anger, their real boundaries, and their authentic no. The line between a spy's double life and your life is actually terrifyingly thin. Look at the typical so-called empath or the chronic people pleaser. They are running the exact same psychological operation. They walk into offices, family dinners, and relationships wearing a highly curated mask, performing a version of themselves that is convenient, safe, and designed to be liked. And just like a compromised spy, they pay a devastating price. Their authentic self slowly rots and dissolves under the weight of a never-ending performance. And that is much more widespread than you think. A landmark 2023 study by the American Psychological Association revealed a staggering statistic. 60% of working adults reported feeling that they cannot be their authentic selves at work. Let that number sink in. 60%. This isn't a minor social glitch. This is a global psychological epidemic. It shows us exactly how many people are walking into offices, family dinners, and relationships every single day running a deep cover espionage operating against themselves. The average person now maintains multiple digital identities. A WhatsApp version for family, another for friends, a LinkedIn version, an Instagram version, each one curated. You use the exact same mechanism as Barsky when you wear different identities in the office, at home, on your social media profiles. It means that you who watches this right now, with extremely high probability, are the undercover agent in your own life. But just like a compromised spy, you will inevitably face a post-operational psychological collapse. Because you cannot betray yourself every single Monday and expect your mind and body not to eventually burn the whole house down. And here we must ask the ultimate question. If this neurological hijacking is so powerful, why is it that some people become compliant cogs while others manage to retain their humanity and moral compass? What allows a person to resist the collective frequency? The difference lies in a single painful choice: the willingness to manually turn the observer back on and face your own shadow. Those who override the biological drone script and escape the trap of the deficient ego do so by crossing three distinct psychological borders. First, the integration of evil. The empath who becomes a weapon of the system is terrified of being bad. They are addicted to their own flawless image of holiness. But the conscious individual does the hard, terrifying work of therapy and self-reflection. They look into their inner abyss and say, yes, I have teeth. Yes, I carry rage, envy, and the capacity for cruelty. The moment you stop hiding your aggression from yourself, you no longer need a tyrant, a church, or a political party to give you permission to unleash it. You reclaim control over your own fire. Second is resigning from the role of the savior. To become a fanatic or a state-sanctioned executioner, you must maintain a grand delusional belief that you are saving the world from bad people. It is the ultimate spiritual pride wrapped in submissive robes. The healthy individual abdicates this throne. They no longer play along their unhealthy ego trying to become Almighty God. They accept that their only true responsibility is their own consciousness, and they strip away the crown of thorns that they use to control others through guilt. Third is the capacity to endure exile. For a traumatized child, being cast out by the tribe feels like actual death. The deficient ego will submit to any dictator and tolerate any atrocity just to belong, to feel the warmth of the herd. But the sovereign individual develops the rare golden muscle of psychological autonomy. They choose the pain of isolation over the safety of a cage. They say, I would rather be cast out and viewed as bad by the collective then betray the truth of my own consciousness. It is precisely this internal failure, the refusal to cross these three borders, that transforms the unexamined empath into history's perfect accomplice. Sovereign empathy is not submissive weakness. It is not the erasing of the self. Sovereign empathy is the overflow of an unshakable sovereign psyche that knows exactly where it ends and where another human being begins. And here lies a mind-bending evolutionary truth that today's spiritual culture completely misunderstands, birthing the phenomenon of spiritual bypassing. The internet is flooded with pseudo-spiritual concepts urging you to destroy your ego, dissolve into the cosmos, or surrender to the divine frequency. The deficient ego eagerly lunges on New Age ideas of dissolving the self because it is a brilliant, desperate attempt to escape the agony of looking at its own shadow. It is a flight from the uncomfortable, brutal reality of personal responsibility. It masquerades as enlightenment, but it is nothing more than infantilism wrapped in sacred vocabulary. This is exactly why the modern escape into spiritual bypassing is so dangerous. Because the ultimate evolution of human consciousness requires you to first become a fully integrated sovereign subject. You cannot surrender a self that you do not yet own. You must build a healthy, structured ego, map your boundaries, look your internal monsters in the eye, and learn to hold your own light. Only after you have fully inhabited your subjectivity do you earn the capacity to safely transcend it. If you try to bypass the stage, if you try to surrender a self you do not yet own, you won't dissolve into God or enlightenment. You will simply dissolve into the herd. You will turn off your prefrontal cortex, wipe out the observer, and leave your brain wide open to download the nearest collective virus, becoming a weapon in the hands of the next architect of horror. There is a razor-thin line we must draw here. We must separate the neurotic, codependent empath who shrinks to accommodate everyone out of sheer fear of rejection from a person who possesses genuine, highly developed psychological perception. If you truly sense the hidden grief beneath someone's composure, the precise wire of anxiety beneath a confident voice, or a lie before it has even fully formed, you are carrying an immense, heavy burden. Jung recognized this as the seer archetype. But in mythology, the seer's gift is always paired with profound suffering until it is consciously integrated. Cassandra saw the inevitable fall of Troy, but her curse was that she spent her life frantically trying to force sight into people who had voluntarily closed their eyes. Unintegrated perception inevitably turns into a weapon. You begin to wield your insight to judge, correct, and arrogantly preach, dragging people into their own shadow against their will. Jung called this the prophet complex. This is exactly what derailed Friedrich Nietzsche. He identified his ego with his vision, used his sight as a weapon of moral superiority, and was ultimately crushed by his own inflation. But the history of the Soviet spy Jack Barsky provides a beautifully simple, brilliant blueprint for healing. When he was eventually confronted by the FBI, Barsky was given a choice between his two conflicting identities: his real identity as a Soviet citizen or his fabricated identity as an American family man. And he chose his American life. He chose his daughter. Years later, Barsky wrote a book, gave interviews, and spoke publicly and honestly about both of his identities for the very first time. He stated that the simple act of telling his story, the real, full, unedited story, was the first time in decades that he felt like a complete person, not a Soviet operative, not a cover identity, but a whole human being with a complicated history, who was finally allowing himself to be known. That process, the act of being genuinely known by at least one other person, is what psychiatric and sociological research consistently identifies as the single most powerful antidote to the psychological damage of long-term identity concealment. For deep cover operatives, the research is clear. Healing requires one specific, non-negotiable thing above all others: safe relationships. Relationships where the performance can stop, where the mask can come off, where you can say out loud to another human being, this is what I actually think, this is what I actually feel, this is who I actually am, and know that you will not be destroyed by it. If this process could heal the shattered psyche of a Cold War Soviet spy, it will work for your psyche too, especially if you have spent your life operating undercover as an empath. Just one relationship where you can step out of the shadows, where you can be authentic and where you are seen for who you truly are, is enough to dissolve the deep, suffocating loneliness you have carried your entire life. The journey from a deep cover spy managing a fake persona to a sovereign individual is not just a personal victory. It is a microscopic reflection of a massive global tectonic shift. When you choose to stop betraying yourself, you are not just healing your own life, you are actively denying fuel to the collective machine of darkness. Because as history has shown us, when enough individuals refuse to play dead, the entire architecture of global tyranny begins to crumble. The Nuremberg trials forced humanity into a massive, irreversible evolutionary leap. For the first time in history, the global community declared that just following orders is not a shield, and that individual consciousness is the ultimate authority. But this global awakening is not an overnight shift. It is anything but smooth, and it is certainly not comfortable. According to ancient Vedic calculations, that very visual piece of cosmic cosmology we referenced in our previous episode, the transition between cosmic ages takes about 2000 years, and we are barely a little over a century into this transition. During this long, turbulent dawn, the old world does not go quietly. The resisting collective ego, desperate to maintain its grip on power and terrified of losing control, will continue to ignite conflicts, demand compliance, and manufacture crisis. The collective ego is formed by the egos of individuals, and because reality is a fractal, this fractal of horror is not confined to history books. We see it repeating around us today on various scales across every continent. On one end of the spectrum, this pathogen manifests as raw, overt physical violence. We see it in Latin America, where ordinary cartel foot soldiers honestly view themselves as pure family men, building shrines to Santa Muerte to bless the very hands they use to torture rivals. We see it in the horrific tribal cleansing in parts of Africa like the Eastern Congo, where regular villagers, people who just want quote-unquote safety for their own group, are easily weaponized by warlords to butcher their neighbors overnight. We see it in terrorists who slaughter innocents and blow up cities in the name of God and faith. But don't let the lack of blood fool you. On the other end of the spectrum, across the American and European West, this exact same disease takes on a highly sophisticated, sanitized and subtle form of psychological violence, where the culture of total compliance has weaponized goodness itself. We see it in corporate boardrooms, where managers wrap themselves in the language of deep empathy and safety, while actively filing anonymous HR complaints against colleagues for a perceived microaggression or a non-compliant facial expression, turning offices into hotbeds of quiet bureaucratic sadism. We see it in the terrifying architecture of modern online mobs, where regular polite citizens eagerly join digital lynchings to socially and financially destroy anyone who dares to voice an independent thought outside the accepted narrative. We see it spilling onto the streets, where ordinary people from quiet suburbs join chaotic riots, gleefully burning down small businesses and looting stores owned by their own neighbors, completely blinded by the group's ideological alibi of historical justice. And then there is the place where the subtle mask of moral superiority drops entirely, merging into absolute industrial-scale destruction. It is the visceral reality of the Russian aggression here in Ukraine, where regular as clockwork I'm jolted awake in the dead of night by blinding flashes of light, the deafening roar of exploding missiles, and the sickening sound of window glass shattering across the neighborhood from the blast waves. In fact, it is exactly why I often find myself sitting at my microphone, my camera, or my computer, recording or drafting these episodes in the heavy quiet hours just before dawn. Sleep becomes impossible after nights like that, when your bedroom walls shake from shock waves. So instead of lying awake in the dark, staring at the ceiling with my heart racing, I sit down to speak to you, turning that raw midnight adrenaline into the very words you are hearing right now. Russia launches these attacks with the blessing of the Russian Orthodox Church with such psychotic consistency that the sheer amount of wealth they burn through just to murder and torture Ukrainians could comfortably feed and sustain the desperately impoverished populations of Russia itself, entire republics and regions within it. Think about the sheer, unhinged madness of it. And let's be brutally clear, it is not Putin who presses the launch button on those missiles. It is not Putin who drives the tanks across the Ukrainian border. It is not Putin who personally rapes, tortures, and executes civilians in occupied villages. It is done by the hands of the quote-unquote little people. I know this deeply because of my own work. I worked with a human rights organization that meticulously documented these very war crimes in Ukraine, an organization that was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize for its efforts in protecting human rights. As of today, their database is one of the largest archives of war data in Ukraine, containing over 107,000 documented cases of Russian war crimes in Ukraine and its temporary occupied territories. 107,000. Through this grueling process of documenting raw testimonies and cold evidence, I learned the most terrifying truth of all. These atrocities were not committed by engineered monsters. They were committed by the hands of the most ordinary, regular people, fathers, sons, and brothers who simply found a legal, state-sanctioned way to let their suppressed, monstrous shadows run completely free. And it is happening right now, alongside over 30 other active armed conflicts raging across the globe. We see this exact same pathology scaled up to the heights of modern geopolitics, completely erasing borders. We see it in the global strategies of world powers, where political establishments and ruling administrations act as the ultimate inflated ego, drunk on power, control, and messianic complex of their own rightness. Whether it is the raw, brutal, and primitive violence of dictatorships in countries like Russia or North Korea, or the highly sophisticated, glossy, and sanitized methods used by Western administrations, the underlying psychic disease is identical. The only difference is the tool of execution. One uses tanks and open terror, the other uses sophisticated Polish methods of financial pressure, hybrid proxy wars, and beautiful rhetoric about protecting democracy. Both wear a mask of absolute moral superiority, but under the hood, it is the exact same insatiable thirst for total control. But no matter the regime, the monster cannot survive without its fuel. The lethal current is always generated from below, by the millions of ordinary citizens. These are the deficient egos who sustain the bloody architecture through their votes, their aggressive public cheerleading, or simply their silent code compliance. They happily outsource their conscience to the state in exchange for a false sense of national safety, allowing the machine to erase the sovereignty of entire nations. This is all the exact same pathogen, a deficient ego that refuses to look at its own internal cages and instead projects its toxicity outward, fueled by an aggressive, desperate urge to force everyone else to be just as trapped, just as broken, and just as dead inside. If the inflated ego takes the throne of religious and political institutions to gain the power to conquer and suppress, from the Crusades of the past to the largest conventional war in Europe since World War II, Russia's brutal invasion of Ukraine today, the deficient ego provides the fanatical worshippers, the loyal executioners who eagerly help them pull the trigger. Do you see the grand design now? Do you see how the modern world is completely built on the ego? The entire planet has become a massive symbiotic ecosystem of the inflated and deficient ego. They need each other to exist. The tyrant needs the submissive crowd, and the crowd needs the tyrant to avoid the terrifying burden of personal responsibility. But these are all mutations of the ego. Now you finally can understand why a healthy, independent, sovereign ego is such a rare, endangered species in our environment. The system actively weeded it out. For this toxic global machine, a healthy ego is the ultimate threat. It cannot be controlled, it cannot be shamed, it cannot be absorbed by the herd, and it cannot be bought with the cheap currency of collective approval. And this is exactly why, if you want to break free from this matrix of self-betrayal, if you truly want to heal and step into your authentic power, you must hear this clearly. No one is coming to save you. Stop waiting for an external savior. Stop waiting for a leader, a guru, a perfect partner, or a global shift that will suddenly make it safe for you to become authentic. The world you live in is designed to keep you complicit. The tragedy of the so-called empath is that their empathy is deeply codependent. It is an empathy of merging where there is no sovereign I, but only a desperate attempt to dissolve into the other to escape personal responsibility for oneself. Sovereign empathy is differentiated. It requires two fully formed sovereign subjects. You cannot genuinely emphasize with another human being if you yourself do not physically and psychologically exist in that room. The only way out of this matrix of self-betrayal is inward. You can only heal from this pathology by yourself. Look directly into the mirror. Strip away the beautiful mask of your innocent, sensitive empathy and ruthlessly confront your own deficient ego. Acknowledge its cowardice, its hidden rage, and its addiction to safety. Master it, heal it, because nobody else will do it for you. This is your only true salvation, and it begins the moment you refuse to be a harmless grain of sand. Every positive shift over the last century toward the transition from ego to consciousness awareness, from the abolition of slavery and the rise of women's rights to quantum mechanics, neuroscience, and international law, was forged exclusively by individuals who stopped waiting for the external savior. And this is exactly how you align with the global awakening of consciousness. In essence, the entire process of awakening relies on these pioneers creating the conditions for those who will follow. This is how, over the course of these 2000 years, the average level of consciousness on this planet will rise high enough to manifest an entirely different way of living, what ancient traditions envisioned as heaven on earth. But it does not start out there. It starts right here, right now, with your willingness to look into your own shadow and claim total responsibility for its integration, instead of hunting for villains or saviors in the outside world. So, where does this leave us here in the present day? It brings us back to a vital, sobering realization. The battle for the future of humanity is not fought on distant battlefields or in crowded parliaments. It is fought right inside your psyche, in the thousands of silent micro-choices you make every single day. Every time you betray your truth just to keep the peace, every time you swallow your authentic no because you're terrified of looking difficult, every time you let someone trample your boundaries just to remain convenient, you are making a micro-investment in the next totalitarian regime. You are feeding the deficient ego. You are reinforcing the very cage that will eventually breed envy, passive aggression, and violence. True awakening is not a passive state of spiritual compliance, submissive empathy, or toxic positivity. True awakening requires a psychological sword. It requires your inner knight to stand up and fiercely protect the sovereignty of your consciousness, your inner queen. And if you have spent your life identifying as an empath, this is the exact moment you must wake up to a terrifying yet liberating truth. Inside you lies an immense volcanic power. Your hypersensitivity is not a weakness, and it is certainly not a badge of fragile holiness. It is raw, concentrated psychic energy. And you must realize that if you do not learn to master this power, it will destroy. It will either continue to implode inward, rotting your body with illness, anxiety, and depression, or under the right historical pressure, it will explode outward, transforming you into a blind executor of collective cruelty. But if you choose to claim it, if you choose to stop fleeing into the illusion of innocent victimhood, step into your shadow and consciously direct that force, you become unstoppable. You unlock the capacity to build, to protect, and to create immense, undeniable value in this world. You finally shift from being a fragmented terminal of the crowd into a sovereign channel of truth. The final sovereign stage of this psychological awakening is what Jung called the Transcendent Function. It is the exact moment when your sharp perception stops being your wound, your shield, or your ego's badge of honor. It becomes something far simpler and infinitely more potent. It becomes a quality of your absolute presence. An integrated sovereign does not shout, does not perform consciousness, and feels no urgent compulsion to force anyone awake. You just stand firmly on your 3 meters of concrete. Light does not need to announce itself, it simply illuminates. And in your quiet presence, the manipulator suddenly feels exposed without a single word of confrontation. The grieving person feels held without being smothered. And the one living a carefully constructed lie suddenly senses the silent, undeniable proximity of truth. You are no longer absorbing or containerizing the collective poison. Instead, you embody the very baseline of consciousness that the crowd is not yet capable of holding for itself. It means claiming your 3 meters of concrete. It means refusing to apologize for your joy, your freedom, your success, or your existence. The world doesn't heal when we finally eliminate all the external tyrants. The world heals when the little man inside each of us refuses to be small. It heals when you look at the system, look at the crowd, look at the immense pressure to conform, and choose to remain the absolute, unapologetic manifestation of consciousness. Step out of the cage. The door was never locked.